Okay, so if you haven't used Zoom before, if you hover over the screen where everybody's faces show up, then you'll see most of your controls. And the most useful controls are, of course, on the very far bottom left, where you can control whether your mic and your video are on. If you look at the middle, if you click on the participants box, it'll actually show you everybody that's there and whether or not their mic and their camera are working. And then if they use any of the little extra settings, those are available underneath there, the box that pops up on the right, so that they can, click things like yes and no and go slower, go faster. There's also a chat box. So if you click on the little chat thing at the bottom, that will give you a chat box to the right, which you can also choose to pop out so that it's separate. And you can message everybody, or you can message one person at a time privately if you wish to. So that can be handy. If you don't want to use your mic to ask questions as we go through lecture, it's completely fine to just type it in. If you have questions as we go through lecture as well, it's hard for me sometimes to notice it the way this is set up, so you can always use one of your signs, like you can use the clapping icon or something like that, or you can turn your mic on and just let me know you have a question if I haven't seen those things, because they're not always very obvious. Okay. Before we get started, does anybody have any questions about anything? Okay, so what about the Dropbox? As in, where is it, or? Okay, let's take a look. Let me go back to Canvas. Okay, so here's what it looks like from my point of view. So I set up a Dropbox as a separate module, and I was hoping that that's annoying. It looked like everything was working fine, but now it is not looking like it's working. So I don't want to waste all of our time troubleshooting it, but obviously something's not quite right. So I will work on it when we're done, and I'll send an announcement when it's up and running, or if it's not working, I'll let you guys know what the alternative is. And after that, you should be able to access all the recorded lectures, because it seemed like it was working fine before, and now it's giving me this. So I don't know what happened. Any other questions? Okay, so let's continue on from where we left off with talking about bones. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about, so we've talked about different bone shapes, and so now what we kind of want to look at is general bone anatomy. Mostly this applies to long bones, but some of it applies to all bones. So we're going to look at more specific anatomy rather than just the shape. And then we're going to look at the microscopic anatomy or the histology of it and go from there. So we like to use the long bone as kind of our default because it's the most regularly shaped and predictable bone. And so there's a couple of features that we find on all of these guys. We name different parts of the bone different things. So let me make sure this is going. So most of the length of the bone here is called the diaphysis. Basically just refers to the central shaft of the bone. And then the ends of the bones, both the proximal and distal end, are called epiphyses. So epiphysis is the singular, and we would end it with an es as a plural, and that's what we call the ends. In some books, as you can see on this diagram, in between those two areas, we call it a metaphysis. It's in the middle between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. We're not going to worry about that for our purposes, but that's why it's on there. Now, there's some things that we always find in different locations. So the diaphysis of a bone is typically hollow. And so this whole middle portion here is going to be just a thin shell of bone on the outside. Inside of that is fat storage. Because the adipose tissue that forms fat looks yellow, we call this yellow bone marrow. And the other thing that we see here, oh, that was the wrong button. I apologize. Obviously still working this out. The other thing that we see here, excellent, back to the pen, is that there's usually a large blood vessel that enters the inside of the bone somewhere around the middle of the diaphysis, so mid-shaft on the bone. And because blood vessels provide nutrition for all the tissues inside of the bone, the hole in the bone that the blood vessel goes through is called the nutrient foramen, where foramen is our fancy anatomy word for hole. It literally means hole, and it usually means a hole in bones. So the outer shell of bone, which not only is that most of the bone that we find on the diaphysis, but it surrounds, or it makes up the outside of the whole bone, and this applies both to long bones and every other kind, is made up of a very dense, sturdy bone that we call compact bone, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. Now, this is one of those areas where we have a lot of different words for the same thing. So other terms for this are cortical bone or dense bone. So dense and compact are just synonyms, you know, meaning that this is a very sturdy, heavy type of tissue. Cortical comes from the word cortex. We use the word cortex when something is on the outside, and this is always on the outside. So cortical is describing its location, and then that hollow on the inside of the diaphysis that has the yellow bone marrow is called the marrow cavity, and the other term we'll see for it is medullary cavity. When we have a cortex on the outside, we have a medulla on the inside. Those are contrasting terms we use for a lot of different organs. So medullary cavity because it's a space inside, marrow cavity because it's a space that holds something that we call marrow. Inside of the cortical bone at the epiphyses on the ends, we have more bone tissue, but it's in a different structure. And so because it has kind of the same appearance as a sponge, we typically call this spongy bone. And it also has other names. Oh, sorry. Oh my God, just trying to move things around. It has other names, so its other terms are trabecular bone and cancellous bone. I will try very hard to stick to spongy bone since these two don't necessarily mean a lot to you, but hopefully when I'm done today, trabecular will make more sense. A little bit more anatomy here. So remember that bone organs are composed of a lot of different tissues. And one of those types of tissues is actually some dense, irregular connective tissue. So lots of collagen fibers and it's located outside of the cortical bone around the entire bone. This is going to provide protection and also a path for blood vessels and nerves to enter and exit the bone. So this tissue is called a periosteum. So something that is peri is around, like a perimeter, and it's around the bone tissue. So all of our bones actually have this tough, fibrous connective tissue covering, and the collagen fibers in this tissue actually perforate into the bone tissue, making them connected very intimately with each other. The inner surfaces of the bone are also covered. There's not a protection requirement there, so it's just a thin layer of tissue. And so we call that the endosteum because endo refers to the insides of things. So that whole marrow cavity that we looked at and all the spaces in the spongy bone, which I'll show you in a second, have a very thin lining, just a few cells thick, of endosteum. So none of the bone tissue is actually exposed to any surfaces. There it is. Okay, so here's some close-ups so we can kind of get a look at this. So over here on the left, so this is the cortical or compact bone from right here. And as we can see here, covering that bone is this periosteum. And then if we look internally, we see that we have bone tissue here and a single layer of cells covering the surface, which we call endosteum. Okay, so that's periosteum and endosteum, basically connective tissue coverings of the surface of our bone tissues within our bone organs. So that's long bone anatomy. Some of our bones aren't as complex as that. So flat bone anatomy is kind of the opposite of long bone anatomy because it's literally just two layers of compact or cortical bone with periosteum outside of that and spongy bones sandwiched in between. And I usually talk about it like it's an actual sandwich, but this one kind of looks more like an ice cream sandwich. So whatever analogy you feel more comfortable with, you can use. So in this case, we don't have all of those other anatomical locations. We don't have a diaphysis, we don't have epiphyses, we just have two layers, an inner and outer or superficial and deep layers of compact bone, periosteum, endosteum, spongy bone, and typically there is some red bone marrow in the spaces between the parts of the spongy bone, and that is where not red blood cells, but all blood cells are produced. So that's why we typically look at the long bone anatomy first, because it's probably the most complex. And then we can look at something like this and say, okay, well, but these are kind of the components that we see in all bones because flat bones is as simple as it gets. All right, what do we got next? Oh yeah, okay. So bones have shape details to them. All bones have different regions to them. Just like when we learned this surface anatomy, we kind of looked at the fact that like, oh sure, we have axial and appendicular, but then, you know, every single part of your arm has a different name, and your wrist and the palm of your hand and all that. So when we look at bones, we see that bones have these increasingly smaller areas that also have names. And in bones, the focus is typically on things that are above and below the surface of the bone. So we'll have parts of the bone that stick out, and we'll have parts of the bone that are a little bit lower. And we care about these locations because this is where blood vessels and nerves run across or into bones. This is where tendons and ligaments attach to the bones. And then sometimes it's where the bones are connected to other bones, which are called articulations. So this whole group of terms are osteological terms. So they're referring to bone stuff. And we'll also see them called bony landmarks. And we can divide them into two types. So processes are anything that sticks up from the bone surface. And these are typically places where tendons and ligaments attach. So the bone ends up getting thicker because the attachment site is pulling on the bone and it thickens it up and sticks out from the surface. Foci are any part of the bone that's lower than the rest of the bone surface, and sometimes it's so low that it's actually a hole going all the way through, or a depression. And so this is typically where blood vessels and nerves are passing through. And then we have like a third one, but we find that a lot of these can go into one of the other categories as well. But as I said before, any place where two bones meet is called an articulation. And some of the landmarks of articulations are processes or projections, and some of them are depressions. So we can separate it all out into a separate category, but also some of them fit in one and some of them fit into the other. Now, when we take 2-semester courses in anatomy and physiology, or you take like an anatomy class or something, you end up learning all of the different terms, and you end up learning all the specific ones on the bones when you take a lab course. We're not going to worry about that too much. I just want you to understand that that's what we have, and to tie it back to the rest of the anatomical terminology, this is very much where we get into this geographic features comparison. So, you know, we have lots of things on here that are projections or processes, right? So we've got mountains, volcanoes, plateaus, and mesas. They all stick up above the rest of the surface, right? We've got a whole mountain range here. And then we have all of these places that are lower, and some of them are basically holes, right? Because there's water in them. So, you know, we've got the river here, and we've got, you know, bays and harbors and all sorts of names for different water bodies, and lakes over here. And then sometimes we just have lower areas of land, like the plains over there. So these bony landmarks are very similar to geographic landmarks. So while you don't have to know any of them, here's some examples just to kind of give you some context. So this is the top of the femur. Go to the latest one here. So this is the top of the femur up here. And this is the part of the femur that fits into the socket of your pelvis and forms your hip joint. So this is an articular landmark, and we call it a head. So it would also count as a process or a projection because it kind of sticks out. And then we can contrast that, for example, with this fossa over here. So this is the distal end of the humerus. This fossa is actually where the point of your elbow sits when you straighten your arm. So we have this depression that accommodates the other bones so that they fit together really well as you move. And then we have other things here that are also, you know, stuff that sticks out. So like this is a tubercle because it's sticking out off of the surface. There's a lot of tuber related ones. So a tuberosity is like a tubercle but smaller. And we have some other ones that are more joint related. So condyles are joint related, and facets are as well. So all sorts of different names for very, very similar things. And if you end up taking a more in-depth anatomy course, you'll end up learning more of them. These are just more examples of kind of the same thing. So here's the pelvis. The shallow part where the head of the femur sits is over here. It's actually called the acetabulum. And like this is the fossa, so a hollow in the bone that is kind of where some muscles attach and like some organs can sit. Let's see what else I put in there. And then some of them are really interesting. So we have tons and tons of them on the skull. The skull is probably the most complex one. But something unique that we'll talk about a little bit when we get to the respiratory system is that we actually have these hollows inside of our bones called sinuses. And you've probably heard of them before. We can get congested in our sinuses. We can get sinus pressure. People can get sinus infections. They're attached to our nasal cavities. And they are a bony landmark, but they're weird because they're internal. And then these are just different types of foci or depression. So there's a hole here. There's a fissure here. It's like a long stretched out hole. And then a canal. Nope, okay, didn't sneeze. Sorry about that. Over here, so that's like a tunnel, basically. And then here's that nutrient frame. And again, so just to show you, to circle back to that, so I showed you the one that's at the center of a diaphysis, but there's actually usually more than one, supplying blood vessels to different areas. And again, a foramen is just a hole through the bone. And so every time we have blood vessels and or nerves going into or out of a bone, we're going to have a hole, and we usually call it a foramen. Excellent. Anybody have any questions before we go to the microanatomy? Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Anybody has questions, you can type it in. Give me 1 second, because I think I do have to sneeze. I'm going to mute that. Nobody needs to hear that. One day I will get my allergies resolved. I won't need so much Kleenex. Okay, so that takes us to the microscopic anatomy. So now we're going to kind of delve into how we end up with compact bone versus spongy bone, and look at the features of the bone tissue again. So kind of going back to the connective tissue things that we've learned about before and getting into a little bit more detail. So we'll start by putting a little bit more clarification to organic extracellular matrix versus mineral or inorganic extracellular matrix. So remember that organic material just means that it contains carbon and hydrogen, but typically they're also molecules that are made by cells. So organic compounds are usually made by life, whereas inorganic ones can be made by life, but can also just occur naturally. So when we look at the organic matrix, it's everything that the osteoblasts are producing and secreting as extracellular matrix. So collagen fibers are going to be a really big one. And then everything making up the ground substance, which is mostly proteoglycans, so really big molecules made of sugars and proteins. And there's also mineral binding components to actually encourage the mineralization. The mineralization happens by actually coming out of the blood and literally solidifying in this inorganic, in the organic matrix, to the point where the majority of the extracellular matrix of bone is now inorganic. So 70% once the minerals deposit, and mostly it is calcium. So a calcium salt is just calcium in an ionic bond with name your various other minerals. The most common one, and you don't need to know this, is hydroxyapatite. Bone is a fairly low water tissue because of this. So by weight, only 25% of bone is water, which is quite low compared to most other parts of the body. So when we look at how we get the cells that make and maintain the bone, we see that the osteoblasts come from stem cells who are destined to become them. So osteogenic cells are ones that aren't osteoblasts yet, but they will become osteoblasts whenever the bone needs it. And then remember I said they secrete the extracellular matrix, and then they get trapped in it, and then they become osteocytes. Okay, question, will I give you worksheets to remember them? So I will sort a worksheet out for you guys. I have been trying to figure out a lot of other things for internet stuff, so I don't have one yet. But I hope you're not relying on a worksheet to help you remember, because remember, these are posted and it's being recorded. So if there's something that you're feeling like you're gonna have trouble remembering, then you should be making flashcards. You should be, writing out little sections for it, writing yourself questions, maybe making yourself a little matching thing. So although, I hope that worksheets do help, please don't think that if something's not in a worksheet, I'm not going to test you on it, and also don't feel like you need a worksheet to help yourself remember, because that's part of good study habits. Any other questions before I keep going? So there's one other type of cell that's really important in bone, and it's called an osteoclast. And osteoclasts actually absorb or break down the extracellular matrix. So whereas osteoblasts make the matrix and osteocytes maintain it, osteoclasts are actually responsible for breaking down matrix that needs to be replaced, which we'll talk about a little bit more soon. So the correct term for that is resorption, and I'll go into that at some point. Probably, hopefully today, I don't know. And these are just some pictures of osteocytes because they look cool. They have all of these little projections, so even though they're trapped in little bone lacunae, they have all these little projections that they stick out, and they connect to the other osteocytes. So they're actually all this interconnected web of cells trapped in the matrix, which is pretty cool. Okay, so we already looked at where the compact and the spongy bone are located, but now we're going to look at the actual anatomical differences between them on the microscopic level. And this picture is the head of the femur that I showed you before. They just kind of chopped it off. So this is the outer surface of the bone here. So this is compact bone, outer surface. This is a cut surface here. And so we've got spongy bone in here, and then in between the spaces is the red bone marrow where the blood cells are made, and the yellow, there's a little bit of yellow marrow here, which is fat storage. So compact bone has a more complicated anatomy. It is the stronger type of bone. We also call it dense bone tissue. Excuse me, and because it's so nice and dense, it typically has a very smooth surface. And because it's fairly dense and thick, in order for there to be blood vessels and nerves going through it, it actually has to be organized around the passageways for those blood vessels and nerves. So the bone tissue actually forms around the blood vessels that are running through it so that it has that good blood supply. Now, the compact bone has a repeating pattern, a very regular pattern throughout, and that is part of what makes it really strong. And so this is going to lead us to a concept that we're going to return to a couple more times, which is the idea of a structural unit. So a structural unit is the smallest something can be and still count as that thing. So for compact bone, an osteon is the smallest unit that's still compact bone. If you break it down any further, you can't define it as compact bone anymore. So we're going to talk about the anatomy of an osteon, what goes into it, and how the osteons are fit together to actually make this tissue. The old term for osteon is Haversian system, and I will hopefully never use that for you again. We try not to use it anymore, but it comes up, so I like to at least mention it. Now, an osteon is basically a cylinder of bone tissue that runs parallel to the long axis of the bone. So if you have, like, you know, a long bone, then the osteons are basically just these little tubes or cylinders, and they're obviously in the bone, but I'm drawing it like this so you can see. Then they're all just, they all run that same way. So they all get packed in here. And through the center of each osteon is actually a set of blood vessels and nerves, and then the bone tissue forms around it. It will be better if I just show you this. So we have this central passageway for the blood vessels and the nerve, and then we have layers of extracellular matrix formed by the osteoblasts surrounding this central passageway. So each osteon is going to have multiple layers, which they're called lamellae, it just means layers, that run around and around. And the cool thing this is showing is that the collagen fibers in each layer run in different directions, which actually makes the osteons really, really strong to withstand force from a lot of different ways. So when we look at how these guys come together, this is a little wedge out of the compact bone of a long bone. So here's the periosteum here. And so every time you see this central circle, that's an osteon. So we have all of these osteons in here. They just kind of get packed together, just like you would pack a bunch of poles together. And you can see the layers and layers of extracellular matrix. The osteocytes are within those layers. So there's an osteocyte and all those guys, because they are trapped in between them. And then there's extra passageways that run perpendicular to connect the osteons so that the blood vessels have somewhere to go. And there's extra little bits of extracellular matrix kind of filling in the spaces in between, because if you've ever tried to make a bunch of cylinders fit together, there's gaps, right? There's gaps in between, doesn't all work. So we need a little bit of extra matrix in there in between. Okay, so when you put all of that together, you get this very compact, very dense, very strong bone tissue. We can contrast that with the spongy bone, because the spongy bone does not have these osteons. Instead, we just have the tissue being formed by the osteoblasts as these thin little layers of bone. The terms we use for the shape is a spicule or a strut, and we call them trabeculi. This is why we also call this trabecular bone, because the arrangement of the extracellular matrix in the cells is called a trabecular pattern. So we only have a couple of cell layers thick here. Instead of those nice rings of extracellular matrix, we just have these irregularly arranged layers. And instead of being around blood vessels, all of this bone is actually thin enough that the blood vessels in the endosteum, so the surface of all of this bone, are sufficient to provide all of the osteocytes with whatever they need. So this is a much thinner tissue. It's obviously not smooth, it's all quite spiky, and it has a much less orderly arrangement, but it's still quite strong. And we find that the way that these thin little bone spikes or struts are aligned, they're still aligned along lines of stress. And what that means is that they're able to still provide a structural role in strengthening the bone, even though they're very thin and not as organized. Picture, there we go. Okay, so here we've got a little wedge from the spongy bone in the epiphyses. And so this is showing you we say these little trabeculae, but they're all connected. So it's really more like, you know, like a really crazy messy spider web. And then this is showing you the cross section here. So you can see osteocyte, the 2 to 3 cell layers thick. And then there are blood vessels in the endosteum that are supplying all of this with nutrition. And this is showing you some osteoclasts, which remember can break down the extracellular matrix. So that's the spongy bone. Let me see if I put, there's another one. Okay, these are just different views of spongy bone as well, kind of showing you how thin it is. This one is actually a computer rendered image based on micro CT scans that they did. So that's really how that bone is arranged in the sample that they used. Now, you might think, well, but compact bone is really effective, so why do we have this spongy bone or trabecular bone? And the reason is actually pretty similar to the reason why we have those marrow cavities in the center of the diaphysis. It's because compact bone is really heavy, and if our bones were solid all the way through, we would have to carry way too much weight around and expend too much energy using our musculoskeletal systems. So the basic philosophy of our skeletal system is as strong as is needed, as light as possible. So where we need strength, we put in cortical bone. If we can get away with having less, we'll put trabecular bone in. And if we really don't need it there, that's where we can have those marrow cavities in the center of the diaphysis, because that outside of cortical bone along the shaft of the diaphysis is sufficient. So that's the main reason why we have these differences, because, you know, it's just bones would be too heavy. It would just be ridiculous. Okay, so then we have any questions about anything in this PowerPoint? Okay. I'm going to switch to the next one. And hopefully, that's not the next one. Let me open the next one. Hopefully we'll get through this one. So now we're going to talk about here we go. So now we're going to talk about how we make the bones in the first place. So bone development. And I like to do bone development after I do all the anatomy stuff because I think it makes more sense there. So you're asking about the difference between bone as an organ and bone as a tissue. Okay, so that might have been the part last time that you couldn't hear. So real quickly, bone tissue is where we have these osteoblasts that make the extracellular matrix, and then that mineralizes, and it has the anatomy that we just talked about. So it's either organized into compact bone or it's organized into spongy bone. Now, when we take that tissue and we add cartilage and we add blood vessels and nerves and, you know, periosteum and endosteum and, you know, arrange it into an actual bone, that's a bone organ. And so we've got over 200 bone organs in the skeletal system, and all of them are primarily composed of bone tissue. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so now we're going to look at how we get to those bone organs. How do we make this bone tissue in the first place? So remember that one of the defining features of connective tissue is that it originates from, embryonic connective tissue, which is called mesenchyme. So just like everything else, that's where the skeleton comes from. And of course, cartilages are connective tissue as well. So all the osseous tissue, all the cartilaginous tissue, all of, you know, the periosteum, because that's dense irregular, all of that stuff starts as mesenchyme. But it has to become all of these specific different types. And so the process of becoming, oh boy, something more specific is called differentiation. And we're just going to focus on how we get to bone. We're not really going to worry about the rest of it right now. And so there's actually two ways that the mesenchymal tissue can become bone organs. And primarily we're talking about forming bone tissue. So there's endochondral and intramembranous ossification. So I'm going to define each one and tell you which bones are formed in that way. Now the bone formation process itself is called ossification or osteogenesis. I actually, even though I bolded ossification, I prefer the term osteogenesis because it literally means bone formation. Ossification can also be used to talk about like mineralizing things, so I think it can be a little more confusing. But both are valid for bone development. Now, most of the bone development is going to occur before birth. So we call that the embryonic period of osteogenesis. But as we know, we grow from infancy all the way through childhood and into puberty. So our skeleton is developing during that time. So that's the childhood period. And even though the bones are formed at that point, they are growing in length as well as size or thickness. So after we talk about how we form the skeleton, we'll get into how we continue to grow it. And the other thing is that osteogenesis actually continues throughout life. So because we're capable of repairing our bones if they're broken, and because we're capable of changing the density of our bones throughout life, we do actually constantly have low levels of osteogenesis going on at any given time. So we're going to start by making a skeleton, and then we're going to work our way down and see how we make it longer, how we make it thicker, and then how we continue to maintain it throughout life. So we'll start with the two different ways that we can actually make bone organs. So endochondral, endo means endochondral, endo means inside of, and chondral refers to cartilage. So endochondral ossification is where the mesenchyme starts by turning into cartilage, and then the cartilage gets replaced by bone. So we call it a cartilage model. So it's literally a teeny tiny bone-shaped bit of cartilage for most of the bones in the body. And gradually from the middle out, osseous tissue takes over and replaces the cartilage. The vast majority of bones in the body are formed this way. So this is kind of just a diagram showing it. Basically, the mesenchyme comes together and forms a cartilage bone model. And then it takes those osteogenic stem cells and blood vessels to come in, and it spreads throughout the cartilage model until we get the formation of a bone instead of cartilage. That's the short version. We don't really have time in this course to go into the details of it, but you can also look it up if you're really curious. Now the other type, intramembranous. So intra also means inside of, basically, it means within. And membranes, we call a lot of things, but basically intramembranous is where the mesenchymal cells directly become bone tissue. So we get osteoblast formation directly. There's no cartilage model. Now, this type of ossification is only good to form bone sheets because we really need that cartilage model to set the shape of a bone if we want it to be a special shape. So because this is only good for sheets, we only see this for the bones of the skull and, for reasons I've never understood, the clavicles. Every other bone in the body is formed by endochondral ossification. And this is an actual picture of a fetus showing you the reddish color is bone and the bluish color is all cartilage. Okay, so that's how we start. We have the mesenchyme, and either it becomes cartilage and then gets replaced by bone, or it becomes osteoblast and makes bone directly. And here's some pictures of that. So basically, osteoblasts form from mesenchyme, they start making bone tissue, and we end up with this flat bone. So 2 sheets of compact bone, spongy bone in between, periosteum on either side. So as we grow from birth through childhood, we have to grow our bones in 2 different ways. So long bones have to get longer, obviously, but all of our bones have to get thicker too. Because if you think about it, you know, if you're starting out with this little bone and it just gets longer, that's not really going to help, right? It has to be proportionally thicker too, or it's not going to be strong enough. I will delete those because that's just not a good shape. So there's 2 different types of growth that we see. One to make the bones longer, and one to make bones thicker. And what we find is that the way that we make bones longer is actually basically the same as the endochondral ossification that most bones started as, where we have cartilage that grows and then gets replaced by bone. So the cartilage is called growth plates, and they're located between the diaphysis and the epiphyses. So in the smaller long bones, we may only have 1 growth plate between one epiphysis and the diaphysis. So like this is like a finger bone, and you might just have 1 growth plate here. But then if you have something like, you know, the humerus or the femur or something like that, you're going to have a growth plate up here, and you're going to have a growth plate down here. Okay. The more technical term for this is a physis. which kind of explains why we called everything else what we did, actually. They all got named based on that. And so we get this, it's basically continued endochondral ossification. So here we're showing you a growth plate. So we're taking a chunk out of the top of the femur, okay? So the top of the femur is up here, your hip's up here, and then you have this cartilage here. And the cartilage is going to grow, and then the cartilage is going to die, and then the bone tissue replaces it. So basically what happens is the epiphysis gets shoved away from the diaphysis, and we put bone, and then we put bone in between. That's how all of our bones got longer. And that's going to continue until we run out of this extra cartilage in between, until the growth plate is no longer made out of cartilage. This is just a picture of it because I think it's pretty. So this is bone down here. This is dead cartilage. This is normal cartilage. So long bones are going to lengthen like that. And then all of our bones are going to need to thicken as we grow. And so the term for thickening bone is called appositional growth. And the way it works is that we're going to add bone to the surface. So we want to make this bone thicker, so we're going to literally add new bone tissue to make it thicker. And as it happens, we have osteogenic stem cells sitting in the periosteum, ready to do this whenever we need to. Now, thickening the bone all by itself doesn't necessarily finish the job. Hopefully I have a slide there. Yes, I do. Okay. Because remember that, we have a marrow cavity and we have spongy bone for a reason, right? We want to keep the bones light even as they're strong. And so while we're thickening that bone, we're actually thinning it out a little bit again from the inside. So we have osteoblast activity on the outer surface of a bone. Let me switch colors. So osteoblasts are working on the outside. And meanwhile, the osteoclasts are widening the marrow cavity from the inside and breaking down any cortical bone to replace it with spongy bone. So the interesting thing here is because now, again, we have basically flat bone formation, and we're going directly to bone and we're not replacing cartilage. This is essentially intramembranous ossification happening to all bones. So the same two methods that our bones use to form in the first place are the same two methods that they use to grow throughout our childhoods. Which part do you need me to repeat? Okay, yeah. Here, let me go back. Okay, so we have osteoblasts on the outer surface of the bone tissue, and they're adding bone tissue. So they're thickening the bone. And then at the same time, we have osteoclasts which are capable of dissolving bone tissue, eating away at the inside surface. So as the bone grows, it does get thicker, but if you think about, you know, a baby bone and it's this big, its marrow cavity is probably going to be like that big. But once you have an adult and their bone's that big, you want the marrow cavity to be, you know, like that big. So you need to increase the size of the spaces as well as thickening and widening the bone. So that requires the joint effort of both the osteoblasts producing bone around the outside, as well as osteoclasts widening the spaces in between. Okay, so the formation of all of this new bone, we call it bone modeling. So modeling is how we end up with the adult bones. And once we have adult bones, we don't stop this activity of osteoclasts and osteoblasts. We actually have some amount of old bone being removed and some amount of new bone being made throughout our lives. So this continued process of removing old bone and making new bone is called remodeling. So if modeling is making the bone, remodeling is this constant reshaping of the bone, even if it stays the same shape. And the reason why we need to do this is twofold. So the major reason is so that we have the ability to adapt our bones to the stresses that we put on it. So throughout our whole lives, our bones can thicken or thin as needed. So when we have very physically demanding lives, our bones typically are thicker and stronger to hold up to what we're doing. And when we have less physically rigorous lives, our bones will thin because they don't need to be that strong right now. And this can go either way, and it can change back and forth depending on how our lifestyle might change. Because of this ability, we use the term dynamic when we describe bone because it's capable of change in response to changing stimulus. Now, even if your lifestyle stays the same, you're still going to bone remodel. And that's because the mineral part of the extracellular matrix becomes brittle as it gets older. So we have to replace it on a regular basis because that decreases the chances of getting bone fractures. Now, one of the reasons why we get conditions like osteoporosis and older people being more at risk of breaking their bones is because they're not as good at this anymore. And so now their bones are literally more breakable because they're not replacing their bone tissue as often. They're also not always adapting as well, and they're not always as active. So they have these thinner, more fragile bones. Yep, okay. So when we look at all of the different reasons for remodeling, we get these basic features. So microfractures are exactly what they sound like. They are breaks in the extracellular matrix that are teeny tiny. They're actually normal, so anytime you start working harder physically, you're going to get microfractures, and that's how your bone knows where strength needs to be added. Anytime we need more mineral in our blood to do things, this is mostly pertaining to calcium, we will take it from the bone. And then what I was describing before, so anytime we need to change the bone in response to increasing or decreasing its use, all of these reasons will lead to remodeling. So when we look at remodeling, it's very similar to the oppositional bone growth. We have to remove the old bone, and we call that bone resorption. and I have this written on the next slide, but that's by the osteoclasts. And then we're going to lay down new bone matrix. We call that bone deposition, and that's by the osteoblasts. So bone resorption, here's its own slide, is osteoclasts, removing the matrix. They're these giant cells with a bunch of enzymes and stuff, and so they just kind of like latch onto the surface of the bone matrix and they dissolve it. And, you know, they do stuff like release the calcium and it ends up in the blood, and we can do all the other things we use calcium for, which we'll talk about slowly over the rest of the semester. Okay, so that's one part, bone resorption by osteoclasts. And then we get to put new bone down, so osteoblasts are depositing new matrix. And remember, this is the organic part of the matrix. The osteoblasts are making, and then once the organic part's there, the minerals can come from the blood and actually ossify that tissue. So that whole process is the bone deposition. And so when you're just trying to replace old bone, you're going to be doing both in balance. If your bones need to become thicker, you're going to be doing more bone deposition. If your bones need to become thinner, or you need more mineral released into your bone, or into your blood, sorry, then you're going to be doing more bone resorption. So which one is in higher proportion depends on the current needs of the body. Now, we don't unfortunately have time to really get into this, but I really can't teach bone and not at least introduce you to this so that you can say that I mentioned it. So we have a variety of rules about how bone knows where to get thicker or thinner. And those microfractures that I mentioned are one of the ways. And so this guy named Wolf, with 2 Fs, he's the one that originally defined a lot of this. And so we typically talk about Wolf's law of bone, which is how we describe the fact that the shape of the bones is based on how we stress them. So basically that dynamic ability of bone to change itself, that it's going to adapt to best withstand the stresses that are put upon it. And that capability is how we get all of those bony landmark features, the processes that stand out, because a lot of the stresses we put on the bone are by way of the tendons and ligaments that attach to them. Let's see if I got a picture in here. It's really hard to find pictures for this. So when I went looking for it, I ended up with this, which is a little weird. So it's just showing you that a highly active individual is going to have thicker, sturdier bones, and someone who is more sedentary, so not as active, is going to have thinner bones because they're not putting as much stress on them, so the bones would have to be as thick. If any of you know your superhero stuff, you know that this particular one doesn't make any sense at all. So I did fix it so that it's the same person, fictional person, but anyway, so that makes more sense. Most of you probably don't care, but anyway, there's really hard to find good pictures of this. So that's Wolf's Law. It's just the idea that bone adapts to stress. Anybody have any questions before we briefly talk about bone healing? Okay, we got 20 minutes. Okay, so yeah, let's get into it. All right. Is that the same? What happened? Okay. All right. So when we talk about bone healing, what we're talking about is how bones recover from fractures, right? So a fracture is what we call damage to a bone organ. And I believe your textbook has a whole little part of the section that's going into details about fractures. We're not going to go into it because I just don't have time to cover everything, and I'd rather talk about how we heal than talk about different kinds of fractures. So one way or the other, we're going to have damage to the bone. And now one bone is probably more than one piece of bone, right? So the way that we get healing to occur is we try really hard to do what we call reducing the fracture. So fracture reduction is where we try to bring the bone ends together and hold the bone in as normal of a shape as possible. And the better we achieve that, the better the rest of this happens. So when we look at how bones actually heal, we find that there's basically 4 steps to it. So the first step is a consequence of the damage. So when a bone is damaged, because it's so vascular and there's so many blood vessels, we're going to have a lot of bleeding. And when we have a lot of bleeding, we get what's called a hematoma. So a hematoma is literally just a bunch of blood trapped in an area where blood vessels were damaged. And that hematoma is going to form across the fracture. And the blood is eventually going to clot, because that is how we stop bleeding. And so then we just have a bunch of clotted blood across this fracture site. Now, technically, that does stabilize it a little bit, but obviously hematomas aren't really very strong. And so over the course of a couple of days, what happens is that we get healing. And so we get this formation of a connective tissue bridge, which we call a soft callus. So it's also called a fibrocartilage callus because that's typically what forms. So basically we get a bunch of these connective tissue cells. So remember the fibroblasts we talked about? They're really good at making collagen and ground substance and stuff. They come in and they lay down a bunch of really quick temporary tissue. We call it granulation tissue. And eventually what we get is the formation of fibrocartilage to try to bridge the broken pieces and hold them steady. And this also sets the stage for the next healing step, because once we have cartilage in place, then we can have replacement of that cartilage with bone tissue. So again, we have this endochondral ossification, and that step is called hard callus formation. So now we're going to form a temporary bone patch. It's not well organized, but it's going to be much stronger than a soft callus. And once that hard callus is formed, the rest of it is just about trying to restore the normal architecture of the bone. So that part is called remodeling. And in remodeling, we try to replace this temporary bone with proper compact and spongy bone in all the areas that it's supposed to be. And if we reduce the fracture really well, then it can be very hard to tell that it ever took place after remodeling is complete. If they didn't get aligned very well, then we might always have some obvious lumps, because the bone is going to heal back together no matter what. It might not look like it used to, though, if it was in a lot of different pieces or if it wasn't well reduced. So here's our first step. So hematoma repair, hematoma formation takes about 6 to 8 hours for that to happen. And the cells in here tend to die because this giant blood clot is not blood flowing, and so they lose their nutrition and they die within the hematoma. So when this soft callus forms, there's also a cleanup process to remove all of this like old dead stuff that's in here. And in the meantime, we're getting this new blood vessel formation. Give me 1 second. I don't know why this dog has to bark at the worst time. Let me just, oh, no, she's stopped. No, she's still going. Where's my mute button? There it is. Sorry about that. Next time I have to remember to pause the recording. Oh well. Anyway, so new blood vessels coming in, and everything's getting cleaned up, and we're making cartilage. And so that typically occurs within about 2 days. We have this soft callus formation. So that helps stabilize the bone ends and helps everything set the stage for the hard callus formation, where now we're going to replace that cartilage with bone. And so this is another good example of essentially remodeling or endochondral ossification. So the osteoclasts are going to remove all the old stuff. Osteogenic cells are going to turn into osteoblasts and lay down new bone. The temporary bone is called woven bone because the collagen fibers look like something woven. It's not as well organized and it's not as strong, but it's faster to make. So it takes a couple of weeks to do that. And then the rest of the healing process is just going to be that remodeling. So this is some woven bone. This is nice organized bone here. You can see how neat and orderly it is. And this stuff is just kind of, there are no nice lines of collagen there. And so then we're just remodeling. So the remodeling length of time depends on how much woven bone there is to replace. So like I said, the better aligned the bone ends are, the faster this happens, and the nicer and more normal the bone is when it's done. And that's all of it there. So then the thing that we want to finish on is sort of the, how you call it, like the global effects of bone. So we're going to look a little bit at calcium maintenance and hormones. And if I don't get through this, I'll just put it at the very beginning of the joint lecture that I have to record for you guys tomorrow. Okay, so the effects of exercise we've basically talked about already, but this is usually when we like tackle it. So I feel like, well, I cover it and then I throw it back in again just to be perfectly clear about how exercise impacts bone health. So the main thing is, of course, the bone density issue. So more mechanical stress means better bone density, stronger bones. And resistance training, so that's like weightlifting and stuff, is typically the best type of exercise for bone density. The worst thing for bone density is being an astronaut, because now you're not even in gravity. But for most of us, it's what we describe as a sedentary lifestyle. So what probably too many of us are struggling with right now, because we're stuck at home for the most part, which is sitting on the couch too much. But a regular workout routine can help combat that. So I know you can't read that really because it's teeny tiny. I think it's meant to be a brochure, but there is a whole Osteoporosis Institute. If you need good information for anybody in your life about bone health, this was a good little flyer. You could print it out or blow it up or something like that. But this is a better one for just kind of showing that resistance training is going to help increase the density of the bone by putting more stress on it. And then this was a nice shot over here of how much thinner the bone tissue is in osteoporosis. So obviously bone density and exercise, although there are other factors as well, which we don't really have time to get into the details of. Now the other thing that's gonna hopefully not affect bone density depending on your level of nutrition, but that affects bone resorption and deposition is mineral homeostasis. So remember that homeostasis is sort of the general set of balancing things in the body. And in this case, we're mostly concerned with the level of calcium in the blood. So mineral homeostasis, specifically for blood calcium levels, that's going to be the primary factor here. And although it can certainly get very complicated when you're trying to look at the details of this, when we look at the basics of calcium homeostasis, there are three major hormones that are going to have a role. The most important one is parathyroid hormone, vitamin D, which is also called calcitriol when we're dealing with it as a hormone, and then this little guy called calcitonin. So technically speaking, we do deal with other minerals here too. So bone is not only where the majority of our calcium is, it's also where a lot of our phosphorus and magnesium are stored. And it really is there for storage, even though it provides this major structural role and does all this skeletal stuff. Ultimately, the blood levels of these minerals determine how much bone matrix we are able to maintain. So when we have extra mineral and we want to store it, we're going to increase our rate of deposition, so increased osteoblast activity. And when we need more mineral in the blood, when we're running low, then we're going to increase our rate of resorption. So we're going to increase osteoclast activity. So parathyroid hormone is the most important hormone regulating mineral homeostasis, especially calcium. And its primary goal is to increase the level of calcium in the blood if it gets too low. It is secreted by the parathyroid glands, which are these teeny tiny glands that sit behind your thyroid up here in your throat. And when it is released, it's because blood levels of calcium decrease. So we get a decrease in calcium levels, and that's going to cause a release of parathyroid hormone. And it's going to have the following effects. So one effect, the one that really counts for our purposes with the skeletal system, is that it's going to increase the activity of osteoclasts. So that means we're going to have more bone resorption and release calcium into the blood from the bone. It also does a couple of other things. So it also encourages your kidneys to not pee out any calcium. So we call that reabsorption in the kidneys of calcium. Another thing that it does is it tells the kidneys to activate vitamin D. So we call that promoting calcitriol synthesis. And we'll talk about what vitamin D does in a second. And the last thing it does is it inhibits osteoblast collagen synthesis. So it doesn't do us nearly as much good to increase bone resorption if we're not also decreasing bone deposition. So we're getting more mineral out of the bone, we're making less bone, we're making sure that we're not losing calcium in the urine, and we're activating vitamin D every time our blood calcium levels get too low. And the goal here is to bring them back to normal levels. So vitamin D has its own activity. It basically supports and enhances the actions of parathyroid hormone, but something that it does that nobody else does is that it increases the absorption of calcium from the diet. So it acts on your intestines to make sure that more calcium that you're eating is getting absorbed into the blood. It also has the same actions as parathyroid hormone on the skeleton, so it's going to encourage osteoclasts and discourage osteoblasts. And it also acts on the kidneys to retain more calcium. So two things it does as basically backups for parathyroid hormone, and then one thing it does on its own. And this one is really quite key. This is why vitamin D is so important in calcium levels, because this is the only way to get more calcium into the body. Everything else is just redistribution and recycling, or, you know, not losing more, but that's the only way we can actually add calcium. And that's me putting pictures in. The last hormone is called calcitonin. So calcitonin is actually made by the thyroid gland. So even though it's in almost the same location, it's the gland next to the parathyroids. And it's the hormone that gets released if calcium levels get too high. So if calcium levels in the blood get too high, calcitonin gets released. And it has the opposite effect on the bone that parathyroid hormone and vitamin D would. It decreases bone resorption, so shuts the osteoclast down, and it increases bone deposition by stimulating osteoblasts. Now, in adults, we know that this hormone isn't critical and that people are perfectly capable of surviving without it, because people that get their thyroids removed don't need calcitonin replacement. But we think it's important in kids because they're growing so much that they can have much bigger fluctuations in their calcium levels in their blood as they're making all this new bone. So calcitonin isn't nearly as important as the other two, but it does have a role, and it is a thing. This is our negative feedback loop for calcium homeostasis. And this is showing you how parathyroid hormone is perfectly capable of handling most of this all by itself. So blood levels of calcium increase, and we end up with a decrease in parathyroid hormone because we don't need it right now because we're already got plenty. This, I believe, is mentioning that calcitonin is getting released too, which does inhibit parathyroid hormone release, and that increases adding mineral to the bone. It does other things too. You can make a loop that explains everything else that's happening too. So what's happening in the kidneys and with the vitamin D as you study. And then if calcium gets too low, parathyroid hormone gets released, and we're increasing bone resorption, and again, you can add everything else that's happening. But that's just kind of a really simplified one that's focusing on the skeletal system. How do we do? Okay, so hope you guys, if you have to go, you can go. I'm just gonna finish this up because we're almost done, rather than having to pick it up again. If anybody has to leave, so I'm gonna do the recording for the joint lecture tomorrow at, what did I decide? At like 4 p.m. You do not have to be there at all since it's not our normal class time, but if you want to listen to it live, you can certainly show up. I'll put it on our calendar in Confer-Zoom. And then I will get it posted either Thursday night or Friday so that everybody can watch it. And over the weekend, hopefully I get Dropbox sorted or whatever I'm going to do. And then if anybody has questions on it, we can tackle them on Monday before we start talking about muscles. And then, so let me just finish this up. Okay, so functions of calcium. So this is basically like, okay, we just talked about calcium. So why is it important? You should probably have some idea. And we're going to talk about some of these things in more detail as we get to the relevant systems. So the reason why this mineral homeostasis stuff is important is because calcium does a lot of stuff when it's circulating in the blood. So it's a critical component of our brain's ability to communicate. So neurons, the cells of the nervous system, use calcium when they communicate. It's also needed for muscle contraction. It's needed for blood clotting. Cells need it when they secrete things. So exocytosis is a cell's ability to make things and then send it outside of the cell. Cells need calcium for any signaling that they do. And then calcium for certain chemical reactions can help enzymes do their job. So that would probably be pretty important too. Phosphate doesn't have as impressive of a list of functions, but considering that it's a component of nucleic acids, including ATP and DNA, it's obviously pretty critical in its own right. And then something that we'll hopefully talk about later is that it helps us maintain an appropriate pH in our body, so it has a role in acid-base balance. So they're both pretty important. And then this is in our textbook showing you calcium homeostasis. This is another version of those negative feedback loops. And then this is just kind of a summary slide about bone remodeling, which I feel like we've mostly covered, but this ties in the mineral homeostasis with the mechanical stress response. So basically, hormones are going to be the ones most likely to determine when we remodel, because that's going to be based on blood calcium most of the time. And then mechanical stress is going to determine where the remodeling is going to occur. So especially when it comes to bone deposition, mechanical stress is going to determine where we might want to add more bone, right? Because that's saying, oh, we need to strengthen up here. It might also be saying, oh, this is where we don't need as much strength. Okay, so bone remodeling is going to be a pretty complex thing because it's the interactions between the mineral homeostasis and the mechanical stressors. Oh, good, that was it. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? Okay, well, if nobody has any questions, like I said, I will be recording the joint lecture tomorrow. I'll send an announcement once I sort out making the recordings available so that you know how to access them, whether it's still Dropbox or whether I use something else. And I will see you all next week. We'll start talking about the muscular system. Stop the recording.